Welcome back to The Place We Find Ourselves. I'm Adam Young, and this is the final episode of Season 5. I will be taking 2 months off to develop new content, and the first episode of Season 6 will release on December 6th. But remember that new episodes release first to the Place We Find Ourselves app, and this is the primary way that I raise support for the podcast. By signing up for $30 per year, you will get new episodes as soon as they are released. Everyone else has to wait 4 weeks. So if you've received $30 worth of help from the podcast, please consider supporting it. And you can do this by going to my website and clicking on Support the Podcast. Okay, today I am joined by Kate Bowler, who is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. Great title. Kate, welcome to the podcast.
I'm so glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so for people, we're going to talk about a book that you've written that's coming out. But first, for people who don't know you, say a little bit about kind of who you are, what you spend your time doing.
Sure. I'm Canadian, and yes, I'm that kind of Canadian who brings that up that early in a conversation. I am a professor of history at Duke Divinity School, so I teach kind of pastors and do-gooders. I wrote a history of the prosperity gospel, so a book about how people think about health and wealth and whether God is blessing them. I've also been just living with chronic cancer since I was 35. So that has been less than ideal, but it does kind of give me a lot of compassion about how we think and talk about the suffering. So I know you and I care a lot about that topic. So I'm excited to talk with you about that today.
I want to make listeners aware of your forthcoming book. We're going to talk about your book. I've got some quotes from your book that I want to ask you about, and it's called No Cure for Being Human. But before we get into your book, when I was in college, some of the advice I got was take professors, not classes.
Yeah, that's great advice.
And I did it. And I'm kind of the same way with books. I read authors rather than books.
Uh-huh.
And so my question is to myself is this author someone I'd want to sit down with and invite into my heart and mind for a little while? Versus what's the book and what's the book about? So before we get into the book itself, tell us a little bit about what would it be like to sit down with Kate Bowler? What are you passionate about?
Well, I am very concerned constantly that I will die of empathy. So I think just feeling kind of desperately in love with the world is a feeling I have too much of. Well, I live in Durham now. I live kind of half my time in Canada, and then I live the rest of my time here. And I feel I'm mostly in kind of ministry world, so everyone I'm around is sort of struggling under the weight of feeling careworn. And that's something I feel very passionately about, is resourcing and loving the people, the helpers. So that's kind of a big part of what I think about, honestly. And then I just have this, I don't really have hobbies. I only have friends. So I have a strong people are magic feeling about people. So I just get I just have a million friends that I am obsessed with. And I do a lot of reading, in my history job, but I think in terms of what defines my life, it's mostly just being, hanging out with people lately, just, pretending to be an amateur sommelier with grape varietals I'm learning to be obsessed with, and then people.
You are at a divinity school. I went to a divinity school. One of my favorite professors there, a guy named Luke Timothy Johnson, who I took everything he taught. And one of the things he said was that anger fuels good scholarship. Now, I don't know if that's true for everyone, but I'm really curious about what got you interested in, because you've done scholarly work on the prosperity gospel. Is there any truth to Luke Johnson's claim for you?
What a wonderful question, and what a wonderful sentiment. Because yes, it was a giant fireball of rage that started me down my path to starting to trying to understand the breadth and scope of the prosperity gospel. When I first became interested in the idea of of just trying to make sense of like what was all this talk about blessing I was hearing, and why were pastors talking about money? I thought that was taboo. And there had been this local church, and I grew up in the prairies and I grew up around Mennonites. And when I found out that my Mennonite friends were attending a church where a pastor had just received a motorcycle as a present and had ridden it around on stage, I was like, absolutely not. This is for Americans. And I was very insistent on that point. And and then I started looking around and I realized that no one had written a history of it. And I did have that initial, how dare you? Well, first, how dare this theology? I was very indignant and also self-righteous about it at the time. But I wanted language, I wanted a framework, and then I decided that I would be the one to do it. And it took me 10 years to write the scope of something that hadn't been, just because it was, and then the only reason no one had done it before was just it was going to be way too much work, and it was. but I but I needed to be that passionate about it to like ruin my whole 20s for it.
So that was your early work. And then you moved into Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies.
Into sadness, Adam, into just pure unadulterated medium sadness.
And now you're on your newest book, No Cure for Being Human. So I want to just ask you about parts of it. You make this beautiful confession in chapter 1 where you say, I did not realize how much I wanted a blueprint for how to live until the day I was released from Duke University Hospital. And you tell a poignant story at that point about being so excited to finally leave the hospital.
Yeah.
So you're getting out, and the nurse pushes you out the door. You're greeted by your husband and your dad. And can you recount like the brief exchange you had with your dad at that point?
Yeah, I was so excited to be released. Like everything you're doing is you're trying to create the momentum to like continue the life that you have. And then I just felt this sudden wave of like panic and fear. And I was so embarrassed, but I realized what I was like, "Hey dad." And he was like readjusting the seats or something to make room for my ridiculously bandaged self. And then I just felt so suddenly embarrassed. I was like, "Dad, like how do I know how to do this?" And he was like, "Oh, I mean, do what?" And I was like, "Live." I don't know if I know how to do this anymore. And I don't think I realized how much I was hanging on a set of assumptions and certainties about how life was going to go, and that all of that hung on a horizon that felt infinite. And then I'm 35 and thinking, well, if I'm not going to last through the year, then like, what is like, just somebody give me a plan, like, give me a formula for how not to screw this next bit up.
I don't know if irony is the best word, but at this point in your life, like you're an expert on the prosperity gospel. And one thing the prosperity gospel offers is a blueprint for how to live.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
and we crave this. I mean,
Yes.
we all want to know, how do you live well?
Yes.
And one thing I think about that, it just for me personally, is a blueprint protects me from having to take my questions, my uncertainty, my troubles, my confusions to God. It protects me from having to engage with God about my desires and my disappointments.
I think maybe partly too just being surrounded by theology world, and then also the sort of wider Christian world had really also been a barrier for me in engaging with God in that way. Is I really had been sold a vision of faith that didn't look like the, make a wish, God will make it come true version, but it did look and sound a lot like certainty. That if I was certain in a kind of way, then I would know what to do, because one version of that is this quite deterministic God has a plan. But even the rest of the kind of cultural formulas people were giving me for faith were like, well, just trust God. Just trust God, and it always felt like the and was, and heaven will make up for this, and trusting God will give you a certain kind of feeling that will always make life bearable, even though you're going to wake up at 2 a.m., remember you have cancer, and going to want to scream. Like that somehow faith would be this thing, this glue, or even this maybe just positivity that would make the rest of it bearable. And I kind of already knew early enough that that was not going to be the kind of faith I would need, but I didn't know what else to replace it with.
And as you're talking, I think it was Glennon Doyle's recommendation for your upcoming book, but her words were only Kate Bowler tells the truth.
Oh, that's so nice.
And what I'm thinking, the reason I think of that right now is in my mind, your book is prophetic and prophets tell the truth. And you're telling the truth about some things about our culture. Thank God there's a Canadian who's telling the truth about some things about American Christian culture. So let me go back. We're still in chapter 1. And here's what you write. Tumors budded and spread across my colon and liver without my consent, and here I am. I feel a spark of horror each time I remember it. We come undone. This is what happens to all of us. We fall ill, we get old, we can't have that baby or keep that relationship. We missed our chance to go to this school or take that job. So it's not a stage 4,
Yeah.
cancer diagnosis in your mid 30s for everyone when you have one child and a budding career. But it's always something.
Yeah.
Something happens and we come undone. Sooner or later, something will unravel us. What was it, Kate? What was it like for you to come undone?
Well, I mean, and thank you for saying that I tell the truth because that's partly why I started writing is I have been a huge liar out loud. I mean, truly, like I have been very committed to the kind of framework of not really allowing myself to let anyone know I was coming undone. I have always I and part of it is just like the endless work of gender, but like so positive, wanting to be the good wife, the good mom, the good friend, wanting to be the good cancer patient, wanting to
Yes.
be easy to be around, and like the auditioning. And part of that is like a desperate desire to survive, where you're like, if you care about me, then, you know for me, coming undone was not being able to say that life was going to add up, that there was going to be enoughness that I was going to magically be able to find, that I wouldn't even be able to have my like ambitions and my stupid dreams, which I have cherished. I mean, I've cherished my ambitions just to make life fun and exciting and like sprint at something. And then to feel like I didn't have it felt like my future and not just like my future was taken away in this really concrete way, but like my futurism. I've always been that sort of middle distant person that was always never here, but somewhere a little bit 2 steps ahead in my own mind. And it took away a whole way of like being for me.
Yeah. And when that happens, whether it's trauma,
Yeah.
whether it's medical trauma, whatever it is, we come undone. And most of us spend much of our lives trying to manage or prevent that day from coming,
Yeah.
but it comes. And even if it doesn't happen to you personally, it will happen vicariously. I'm thinking of Will Willimon's story. I assume it's Will Willimon. You just call him Will in your book.
Yeah.
A colleague of yours, I read him in seminary, and you relate a story, a conversation in the book that the two of you had. Will you share what he says to you when he's going out to do a funeral for a child?
He said he was about to have to go out, give a sermon. He's got his clerical collar on. He's going to be facing down the grieving parents, not just like the friends and family, but just like the front lines of the person who has lost everything. And he paused right before he went out, and he just looked up at God and was like, "Don't make me go out there and lie for you again."
Right.
I thought that was like that I had because I'd had this fear, right, about faith. Is like, God, are you going to make me a liar? Or it's like, is there going to be like, I am trust falling whether I like it or not. Like, are you going to catch me? Because no math that I am aware of is going to make this add up.
Right. And if you're living your life with eyes open at all, you know someone who has come undone, and their life is an invitation to you
Yeah,
to engage reality in a deeper way.
that is such a beautiful thing to say, Adam.
When Glennon Doyle says Kate Bowler, she's the only one we can trust to tell the truth, like your book, both of them, their confession, they're prophetic because you're calling out some things that are bullshit, but they're also confession because you're saying, look, here are some of the things that were not well inside of my heart that my cancer forced me to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's why I love being a historian in moments like that, because I want to like hold those up for a moment to the light. Like, what is the story here? And there's usually like a little bit of wisdom in there. And then there's all this other stuff that has just been a weight. And like I need to learn to put it down.
Yeah. One more story from chapter 1 that I love. You recount an interaction you had with a doctor, and the doctor has just told you that the survival rate for people with your cancer, stage 4 colon cancer, is 14%.
Yeah.
And you're in your 30s
Yeah.
with a young son, and he says 14%. Can you share the rest of the interaction? Because I love how you engaged this doctor.
Oh, that poor kid. I mean, because I was so overwhelmed by the fact that we were the same age. And I had just kind of seen him as like generic doctor until I just took a second and realized, oh, he's a kid with brand new sneakers. And this is probably his first go around, but this is my first go around. And like neither of us seem to know how to do this. And I grabbed his arm without thinking and like wouldn't let go. And I just said, "Oh, oh, bud, like you're gonna need to hold my hand if you're gonna tell me stuff like that." And so he like very sweetly sat down because he didn't have a choice and like bolt upright. And we sat there for a while when because he'd said 14% survival. It felt because news like that feels so surreal. It couldn't land and then all of a sudden I realized as he was getting up to go that I didn't know what survival meant.
Right.
And then he looked at me and he sat back down and he said, 2 years. And then he just like took my hand again, like voluntarily. And like there's been a minute there where I have relied on strangers to like be the to be the one that holds my hand. It's almost always a stranger. And like God bless them. All those people in the hospital who allow their humanity to take up a lot of time that they don't have. I've been so horrified and grateful for the way that there's not a version of my life that I should actually do by myself, or even if I like orchestrated friends to be there.
You were teaching him how to be a doctor,
Mm,
which is what patients do. And as a therapist, it's what my clients do. They teach me more often than they realize, like how to be a therapist. But you were teaching him how to be a doctor. But why do you think that sentence came out of you? Say a bit about how important physical touch is for people who are suffering something big and who are terrified.
yeah. I've had a very hard time even coming back to my body when there's news that feels that surreal, because it just kind of feels like someone screaming, but it's kind of in the distance and I can't think. And just the feeling of other people has always felt like it kind of puts me back together in some way. And I have loved it when people just put like a hand on my shoulder or on my head. It's been one of the great blessings of being around a liturgical tradition where like I just get like all greased up in an acne shape space, like cross shape acne on my forehead. Like I feel remade when people surround me like that. And it's their bodies. Suddenly I'm a person again, but for a second there I really wasn't.
Yeah. In chapter 4, you talk about the loss of dreams. And here's how you put it. You say, I had wanted 2 kids. I'd wanted to travel the world. I'd wanted to be the one to hold my mother's hand at the end. And then you write a really interesting couple of sentences. Everybody pretends that you only die once, but that's not true. You can die to 1,000 possible futures in the course of a single stupid life. So this is a podcast about how trauma upends our stories. And one of the things that trauma does is it causes deaths, multiple deaths. So what do you mean, Kate, when you say that you can die to 1,000 possible futures in the course of a single life?
Yeah. When you have a glut of choices that you don't realize, or you imagine yourself or your life as constituted by choices. There can just be like a zillion little mini plot lines that you imagine for yourself that you can kind of flip between. And I've had a lot. I really wanted to be very close friends with Anne of Green Gables, who is a fictitious character, a much beloved staple of Canadian childhood literature. As a kid, we celebrate that in kids, and I had a million versions. I was a seafaring English orphan for some time. I was also, as you could tell, wildly unpopular. And there was just all the what ifs, and there's the what ifs of college, and maybe I could be a this and maybe I could go there. And someone really has to think through whether the field of Egyptology has really really considered the contributions that I would make if only I were given a trowel. And living in these million some days, which is what we can do even in like bucket lists or people's fantasy retirement stories. I didn't realize that you would really only get one, and that this one would largely be determined by things that I wasn't choosing.
Yes. Which is such an un-American thing to say.
Yeah. And such an I mean, it goes against our culture of hustle, where like you just need to apply yourself, comma, Adam, comma. Are you not really considering what a side business could offer you and your family? Like, we have these dreams. You could be your own boss. We have work versions, we've got exercise versions. Your potential body is about 6 months away. The way women are sold stories about fertility and family planning. I mean, these are wildly self-constituting words in which we really imagine and are told that like life is what we make it. And
Mhm.
then it isn't. And then just it's lightly flicked out from underneath us. And then all of a sudden we realize our lives are made of paper walls. I have not enjoyed that, not one tiny bit. I miss that feeling of durability. I mourn that when I feel delicate. I like resent it when I'm like as delicate as I feel lately. I would pick something else. I would pick a fantasy over this half the time.
Hmm. I mean, what you're putting words to, the way I think of it, or the way a mentor of mine, Dan Allender, has put it, is that we're at war with our stories. Very often, we're not fond of the story of our life to date.
I love you for saying that. I feel an overwhelming love to you right now. Yes, absolutely. And then when we feel like failures, when the story we told or were told is not determinative, like when it doesn't hold.
Yeah, and it is the culture that we swim in if you grew up in America. And it sounds like if you grew up in Canada. So let's talk a little bit about America for a minute, because there's a place in the middle of the book where you talk about the value of individualism in America and how it has evolved to now include, as you put it, conquering our own inner worlds. We not only believe that we can conquer the world out there, but we believe that we should be able to conquer the world inside of us. And cancer, chronic illness, like these things have a way of disillusioning us of false truths that we hold oh so very dear. You couldn't conquer your inner world. I mean, you had have
Yeah.
cancer. But what you're writing about in the book at places is you couldn't make it shalomi inside of you.
Yes. What a great word. Yes.
Why do you think so many people in America believe that we need to conquer our own inner world? Because look, people, as a therapist, people with trauma, good luck conquering your inner world.
That's right. Yes. Well, I think there's a lot of intellectual strands that combine to make a really tight knot on that argument. And one of them is the bootstrapping story of rugged individualism. This has it's a frontier mythology. It's a religion in the city, a theology in which people move. Like this is part of why this story really consolidates in the Gilded Age, in which people are seeing vast economic and racial inequality way up close for the first time in American history. Late 19th century, people are wondering, why do some people make it and other people don't? And everybody loves a reason. And so the reason became, well, certain people are They're self-mastering. They are able, so there's a secular way of reading that. It's just like being self-reliant is always the story. There's a metaphysical, meaning like a long religious tradition of believing that your mind is the most powerful spiritual incubator, that your mind is actually I'm sure we would talk about this topic forever, Adam, is the like triumph of these mental paradigms in which we're not really just, mind, body, spirit, genetics, intuition, whatever. We are primarily thought machines. All of these created this far too high theological anthropology, high view of what we can do, really focused on the power of the mind. That's how we figure out who winners are. Winners are the people who then can exhibit all the emotional proof of having a conquered inner world. That's why we have a million Instagram monsters who yell choose joy to people who are suffering. And we're convinced that that at least our minds are solvable, and that our minds kind of work backwards into our bodies. And honestly, Adam, even if we talked last year, it's taken me even a bit to kind of try to come up to speed to things you already know about embodiment and about the nature of trauma. Is I would have just told you that, like, as a cancer patient, it was my job to kind of get my attitude right. It's been hard to undo it.
Yes, because when you get cancer, it's clear what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to learn the life lessons.
Yes.
You're supposed to become a more spiritual person.
Yes.
You're supposed to have a positive can-do attitude.
Yeah.
And others are supposed to refer to you as this person who has done this.
Yeah.
And this is what's supposed to happen when you get cancer. Your books are saying it didn't happen that way for me. It's not happening that way for me. And there's something wrong with the cultural milieu, which is very influenced by Christianity.
Yes. Yeah.
That says this is how it's supposed to be, because it's not biblical.
No. I mean, unless we think that the early church's martyrdom was really just them failing to live into their winner, best life now paradigm. Yeah, thank God we have a whole religious Christian tradition based on suffering. I mean, that the not yetness of our world is so obvious in scripture, but it is really painful to see. And I think the pandemic has opened up, I hope, a different framework around which we can imagine the precarity of ourselves and our world. But for a bit there, it kind of felt like I was the sad story who sort of like ruined every childhood birthday party. It was like, sorry, guys, the world isn't fair. I don't know how to break it to you, but I'm here to do that on Saturday morning.
Yeah. I mean, your presence, your life, when you walk into a room, you are simultaneously confronting people and inviting them. And you can't help it. It's because you have this diagnosis, and people are watching your life unfold.
Yeah.
And it is a confrontation and an invitation. In that sense, you're like a prophet, a walking prophet, not of your own choosing, like all the other prophets, but you are.
Adam, from now on, I feel very compelled to have you come along with me to all to all social events in which I feel like I am like the giant pariah. Thank you. I think I would do much better if you were there.
3 more sentences I want to read from No Cure for Being Human. And here's what you write. We find it especially difficult to talk about anything chronic.
Yeah.
Meaning any kind of pain, emotional or physical, that abides and lives with us constantly. The sustaining myth of the American dream rests on a hearty can-do spirit surmounting all obstacles, but not all problems can be overcome. That's what you write. And then you continue. So often we are defined by the troubles we live with rather than the things we conquer. Why do we find it so difficult, Kate, to talk about the pain that lingers?
Mm-hmm.
And what has your experience been when you have risked being honest with people about the pain that's not going away for you?
Yeah. Part of what a crisis does is it kind of invites a lot of people in. It's that sort of like something's on fire, and there tends to be a lot of people who who have the ability to show up in that moment. And because it's so practical, it's so immediate, they're just hearing the news and then you're sort of processing that in real time. I used to think it's just because everyone was just a huge dink that they didn't understand. Honestly, I now kind of have, at least in my own life, realized that it's sometimes because people love you that they're not able to really understand the chronic nature of your life, that there's something about not being able to believe that it won't turn out for you that makes it hard for people to live in that reality for a long period of time. And I think, and I am not a psychologist, so I would love someone who studies cognitive errors to like magically prove this to be true, but I think that once people have synthesized the information, even if it keeps happening, in a way it's not real anymore. And
Mhm.
so I did always sort of feel like every time was like, oh hey, I had a new issue with cancer. They were like, yeah, yeah, yeah. I know that. I know that already. Even though it is, of course, upending my life or
Right.
shocking or so when someone relapses or something, they're like, yeah, 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 I knew that already. Oh no, no, no. This is a world ending moment for that person in that in real
Yes.
time. And I did lose most of the people who were close to me in the transition from crisis to chronic. And
Mhm.
I really don't think that was because they were trying to not be a good friend. I think that just the nature, like the sort of momentum of reality just kind of sweeps people into this, like, hey, what's happening on Tuesday? And, no one wants to like live near the person ringing the bell with like the giant sign that says the end is near, like forever. And I totally get that. But like, I think I was so worried about that I was kind of always auditioning for like, I'm a good friend. I still remember birthdays. I'm not a giant narcissist.
Right.
But then I was like, "Oh, wait, but I'm still actually in the hospital today, and I found it harder and harder to communicate the things that didn't go away."
Yeah. Because, and like you said earlier, this has to do with gender as well, but you're not supposed to be this needy.
Oh my gosh, even just you saying that, that's exactly right. That's so horrifying that that is so true, Adam. That's exactly right. It feels to not just blow up your own life, but then to blow up the lives of the people around you. It always does feel you don't want to be the bad thing. And I have struggled with that thought a lot.
Yeah. My wife is an oncology PA, and we were walking last night, and she was just sharing about her day, and she had been with a 41-year-old woman to tell her about her cancer diagnosis. And the woman said, I have an 11-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 5-year-old, and I don't want my diagnosis to hurt and affect their life.
Yes. Yes.
These are some of the things that people who are in need bear on top of what they're already bearing.
Yeah. The versions of that I hear from other people about whether it's like an addiction or it's leaving an abusive relationship or it's, not being able to care for your own kids in the way that you want to because you're taking care of an aging parent. But like, there's this way that we are so scared of being the thing that happened to them. I mean, it was something totally lovely my psychologist said about like just trying to help me shift from like, how do I make sure this whole project, which is loving other people, like holds? And he was like, Kate, you're pouring into the foundation, but the foundation is not always the part that shows. And like that to me requires, because I get so emotional even just thinking about it, that to me requires like a very deep faith in a God that keeps providing. How do you trust that it's not just you that makes other people's lives okay?
Right.
And I think anyone who launches their kid into an uncertain and scary world right now has to have that trust fall feeling too, where they're like, God, I will not be able to make this project work.
Yeah. One of the illusions that your cancer shined a light on was the notion that life is a series of choices that we make. And here's how you put it. It's a paragraph, but I'm going to read it because it's a good paragraph. When I finished sifting through all the clinical trial data, I had nothing to do but survive the feeling that some pain is for no reason at all. Again, an incredibly unchristian thing to say. It became clearer than ever that life is not a series of choices. So often, the experiences that define us are the ones we didn't pick. Cancer, betrayal, miscarriage, job loss, mental illness. Those are your words. And this is so true. So often the experiences that affect our stories so deeply are ones we did not pick. Life is not merely a series of choices. So what do you mean by this? And what gives you the confidence to make such an un-American declaration?
I mean, it is so anti-American. It's also just anti-modern in the philosophical sense. Like this is the condition, this is the disease of modernity is we are rational, self-articulating, self-constituting beings and just watch me like leap into the future, unencumbered. And I think too, it's part of the nature of pain that also forces us into that, like leads us to that paradigm. Because I mean, there has never been a minute in which I'm not in a, like, if I'm in a lot of pain, that I feel that minute in the way that I would never feel it in a moment like right now when we get to just like have a lovely conversation. But it feels like it takes everything in me, and I have to believe in those moments that it is for something, that I am like in labor, like you get a human being at the end, but with cancer, with giant froggy eyes and a very bossy attitude. With cancer and the whole warrior winning paradigm too, I felt like every bit of chemo or surgery, it all had to like amount to something. And when I discovered that so much of the treatment that I was given was because of the protocol of a clinical trial, which is not medical care in the conventional way. They have a set of things they're going to do to you and to every single person in exactly the same way. When I discovered that a lot of what I went through was honestly for no reason, was for, not for my reason, it was for a study that may or may not indirectly benefit me, and in fact, in some ways directly harmed me. It was so hard to get my brain around the idea that I had been through something that was genuinely a waste. Like it had taken tens of thousands of dollars of my parents and my spouse and my family's money. It had cost us in ways I was never going to get back. It was hard not to just feel, I mean, betrayed, obviously, but then just like fatalistic about how sometimes pain is just like such a waste.
The undercurrent of all of that that's pulsing for me is the word powerlessness.
Yeah. Reading the memoir back, and because I've really been trying to learn more about trauma studies and the field in which you work, and I find it so rich and helpful. And I didn't realize until after I'd written the book how much of the experiences when I was in pain, if I was being led by a trusted figure who kept my trust and deserved my trust, that it was so much easier for me as a person in pain to synthesize and to live through it.
And that is such a profound confession. And I know you're speaking not just medically, but also emotionally, so spiritually. But for people with trauma, if only we can find someone who will walk faithfully and kindly with us in the healing process, healing is possible. But what's so painful for many people with trauma is they can't find someone who will be with them in the thick of their pain.
Yeah, that's right.
And what I'm hearing you say is that when you have had someone with you.
Yeah. I mean, it was infinitely more bearable. So I have been going to see a trauma informed therapist, and that I didn't realize that was a thing. Thank you so much, guys. I'm like so into it. Seriously, I'm so grateful for those insights, and even just thinking about the different kinds of surgeries that I've had, the ones in which I've been kind of swept in because of a crisis. And I have so many really difficult memories associated with the powerlessness, the feeling of people rearranging my limbs and the fear and then I compare that to a surgery in which I had time to think and I got to talk to interesting people that actually had helpful opinions. And even though that same one was like a life and death surgery, I went in with so much more peace, and it was so much easier for me to feel like I could, like, I mean, My doctor friend had this wonderful thought too, where he said, well, just mark the calendar. And on that moment, know the choice you made. And like, you might have tons of information since then, but on that day, you made the best choice with what you had. And like, that kind of peace has been such a gift, but it happened because I was being held by smart, kind, choice empowering people.
Yes. At the end of your book, you tell a story about visiting this tiny chapel off Route 66 on the way to the Grand Canyon. What happened in that chapel, Kate?
I walked in and it was so rough and unadorned. It was the gravel floor and made of just slabs of wood and glass at the end that looked out on the beautiful light. But everywhere I realized was graffiti. It was people having dug their pens in, like whatever they could find, into all the wood, and that there were little bits of like scraps of ugly paper everywhere. And it took my breath away when I realized that these were everybody's prayers. Like they weren't prayers like pious and formal. They were like, did she make it to heaven? And some of it was just directly to God, like, God, please help my daughter to be okay, or help him to be the way he was. And some of it was just like, Joanne, are you there? Like, do you like, can you see me? I'm like, can you forgive what I've done? Like this, the rawness of that was so refreshing to me. It was the feeling of like yelling into the void, but trusting that someone can still hear you. The power of knowing that other people's lives and pain, that they were afraid that they were going to go without an answer, helped me articulate this stuff. That I was like, you know what, God, like this stuff is not going to add up to enough. And just being able to say that feels really hard and important right now.
And you wrote something and offered it. What did you write?
Oh, is it dim? I always get the conjugation of the first word.
It's Doom Spiro Sparrow.
Doom, that's right. I always get the first conjugation wrong. Doom Sparrow Sparrow, which is as I breathe, I hope.
Why that, Kate?
I think hope is so tricky, right? If it's not an answer, then what the hell is it? You know, what the hell is hope? If it's not certainty, if it's not wrapping this thing up, if it's not giving me fucking answers that I need sometimes, she said, half whispering. But this is like the great existential fear that hope needs to be about making this, having made all of this matter. It has really helped me to redefine hope as being like an anchor that gets dropped in the future, and that like God is like pulling us toward it. And it is a story a little bit about me, and it is a story about all of us. And it's a story where someday there won't be cancer, and there won't be fear for our kids, and there won't be parents who lose their memory or people who leave us. And that story is something that is behind us and with us and in front of us. And that is like the wonderful and strange way that Christians get to live in time. And that is a kind of hope that helps me get past like some of the feeling that there was some invisible formula that I had failed to understand in making sense of what my life was.
It has been a delight to spend some time with you, Kate, and thank you for writing this book. Books are labors, and this is a labor of the love in your heart, and it's simultaneously kind of memoir, but it's prophetic. You're saying some things that are true that the culture is not fond of engaging. And so the book is No Cure for Being Human, comes out September 28th. Thank you for today, Kate. Thank you for writing the book.
Adam, you are the absolute best. Truly. This has been such a breath of fresh air for me.
Thanks so much for listening. Episode 101 will release on December 6th, but you have to be a premium subscriber to get it at that time. It will become free to everyone 4 weeks later. So please consider paying $30 per year to support the podcast, and you will get new episodes 4 weeks early. thank you for considering it. You can do that from my website. Just click on support the podcast. Have a good couple of months, everybody.